Hey, like many of you out there, Onia and I's hearts are burdened. For me personally, for many nights, I was unable to sleep because of some of the recent events that's been taking place.
I, like so many of you, have experienced some of the hopelessness and the turmoil of seeing racist actions in the news again and having it result in the tragic loss of life. And just wanting, hoping, praying to see things change and begin to turn around in our country.
And so Ania and I have devoted our lives to love and unity. And so we wanted to, in this video, provide you and equip you with some language and some keys to be able to process what's happening right now, right? And not only give you keys to process it, but we want to help you understand when to take action, when not to take action, and how to pray in this situation. So we're going to address what happened with, I believe her name is Miss Amy Cooper. We're going to address that situation and help you unpack what happened there. We're also going to unpack a little bit of what happened with Mr. George Floyd with the recent murder. And so I'm going to have Onia kick us off. And so if you can, sit back. You might want to grab a pencil and paper. We're going to give you a lot of good information and keys to unpack what's happening.
We, and especially we in the body of Christ, may have an insufficient understanding of what race is. And that prohibits us from being able to engage in conversations around racial inequality, racism, and racist actions because we don't all have the same starting point. So the first thing we want to do today is lay the same starting point. We know a few things about race, and the first thing that we know about race is simply that it doesn't exist. We have mapped the entire human genome at this point, and there is no set of genes that is common to all Black people that doesn't exist in people outside of that race, common to all Asian people or all white people or all indigenous people, etc. In fact, if you look at this picture on the screen, you'll see two young women. But what you may not know is that these women are twins, born to the same parents at exactly the same time, yet you would call one white and one Black. That by itself starts to belie the biological basis of race. What we also know is that race doesn't have a biblical basis. We see in the book of Genesis how we all came from one common origin, one human race together. And so there's no biblical basis for race either. But as any parent who has a kid with a monster under their bed knows, just because something doesn't exist doesn't mean that it's not real. Race is very real in our country. And the way that it's real is that it's a social construct, which means we create it, we reinforce it, and we reward or punish people based on it. What race is the assigning of meaning to physical characteristics. So basically somebody looks at someone, I look at Dale, and I assign him in my mind a racial group. Dale is Black. Somebody looks at me and they assigned a racial group. Onia also is Black. Now look at the difference in our skin tones here. There's not necessarily any reason that you would put us in the same group. And beyond that, Dale was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and I was born in Brooklyn, New York. Yet despite that, we are placed in the same group just based on our physical appearance and being assigned to this group. If you look around the world, there are many, many people who share my same skin tone, but would be classified as Asian or Indian or Latino or Latina based on where they come from and the other characteristics that they have. And so taking a physical appearance and assigning meaning to it means that you take my classification as Black and then you start to assign stereotypes to that. Perhaps you've heard of the stereotype of the angry Black woman before. And so the idea being that I could say the exact same words as someone else, but because this assignment is in your mind and because the stereotype is in your mind, those two things connect and they assign meaning to my physical appearance. And those assignments of meaning to physical appearance have very real consequences. I'll give you an example. My Asian American brothers and sisters who have experienced an outbreak of racist violence as a result of the coronavirus. Well, on a day-to-day basis, they tend to be asked another question, which is, where are you from? No, really, where are you from? That question isn't innocuous because on the days where they receive those questions, they have less and lower quality of sleep than other days. Imagine that, race as a real thing affecting someone's sleep. More than that, it can even affect life expectancy. You see, before 9/11, we didn't see Arab Americans or Muslim Americans as a separate racial group. But after the events of 9/11, there was such an outcry and an unjust condemning of that group that they became seen as a separate racial group. People who appeared to be Muslim experienced discrimination, and this discrimination was statistically shown to reduce their life expectancy. Another way in which the effects of race are very real is with Black and brown Americans who experience injustice in the criminal justice system. Black and brown folks are less likely to use or deal drugs than white folks, but they are much more likely to be part of the criminal justice system as a result of it. So if race doesn't exist, and we're the ones who maintain it and create it, am I saying that we should stop talking about race? Oh, by no means, because the effects are real and they'll continue to exist even when we don't talk about it. There are many countries that don't even collect statistics on race. And in those countries, they are unable to realize the continuing effects of race and this assignment of meaning to physical appearance as it happens. Instead, we need to start to understand, educate ourselves, and recognize the real effects of race that happen day after day. And only by putting new systems in place that combat those effects can we stand a chance of ending it. Now that we've taken the first step and we understand together what race is, I'm going to ask you to take a second step. And this step is a little bit harder than the first step. So please stay with me here, okay? With that understanding of race being an assignment of meaning to physical appearance, we have to also acknowledge that that assigning of meaning is not neutral. There are good meanings and bad meanings that are assigned to physical appearance, which starts to create a hierarchy of race. Now, in the US and in many countries around the world, in this racial hierarchy, whites are at the top and blacks are at the bottom, and everyone else is somewhere in between in this hierarchy. And that's not just a matter of opinion. That can be shown in terms of levels of respect afforded to people, opportunities afforded to people, job discrimination, discrimination in the criminal justice system, discrimination in education. We see all of these results coming out in ways that show, again, the reality of this hierarchy. Given that, what is racist? What can we call a racist action? It's very easy to call things racist when somebody is calling names at someone or someone is wearing a white hat that they maybe shouldn't be wearing. But calling those things racist tends to put our understanding of racism back in the 1950s and 60s. And we want to move forward from there. So I would suggest to you, and I would ask you to think about it via this definition. Understanding racism or racist actions is as easy as understanding what actions am I taking today that help continue and uphold this system of racial hierarchies that hold some people superior to other people. And those can be a number of things. It can be as simple as a parent deciding what school they want their kids to be part of and not choosing one school or the other because, well, maybe they won't fit at that school because that school is majority minority and having their kids in a different school. perhaps is as simple as the stores that we shop at, and realizing that the majority of stores are not owned by Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and having that wealth inequality continue via the stores I shop at, the schools that I'm part of. All of these things can help contribute to this system of racial hierarchy and how it continues in everyday life. I have every year a class of students in Introduction to Sociology. And on their exam that has to do with race, so if you're going to take my class in the future, you know one of your exam questions, I asked them to tell me about something that they did in the past week that was racist. And using that definition of race and racism, there's not a single student who can't tell me something that they did in the past week. And this includes all of my students, whether they're white, Black, brown, Asian, etc. And so that means that we each, if we're not contributing to demolishing this system of hierarchies by race, we're contributing to upholding and continuing this system of hierarchies that exists by race. We can use this understanding of racial hierarchy to start to unpack the incident that happened with Amy Cooper this week. And if you haven't had an opportunity to watch the video, you can Google it. I encourage you to watch it. What happened is a woman was approached in Central Park and asked to put her dog on a leash, which is the law. She is supposed to have her dog on a leash. She, in return, got very upset, visibly angry, and told the man who approached her that she was going to call the police on him and tell them that a Black man, an African-American man rather, was threatening her, which she then proceeded to do. Now this, again, just speaks to our system of race and racial inequality. There is a meaning assigned to Amy Cooper as a white woman, and she understands that meaning is innocent and worthy of protecting. And there's a meaning assigned to the gentleman as a Black man, which is threatening and criminal. And not only did Amy Cooper react based on that meaning in an instant, she also used that meaning to her advantage, knowing that other people also shared that meaning. So if she called the police and said an African-American man was threatening her, she fully expected them to take that meaning of, you're a white woman and you deserve protecting, and there's an African-American man and clearly he is criminal or he is threatening. By having these meanings reinforced and existing in our everyday discourse and our everyday mentality, that's what allows these actions to continue on a regular basis. And so by starting to understand our part in everyday racism, whether it's you see somebody walking towards you at night and you clutch your purse, or you turn the corner, or you walk across the street, that sort of everyday racism contributes to what we saw this week in this incident. And so the way to start to combat it is, again, to recognize that, to start to understand for ourselves what are the racial meanings and what are the racist actions that I take on a day-to-day basis, and start to rid ourselves of them so that we can act as a more equitable society and not see incidents like this happen.
And similarly, there's a direct line of everyday racism that enables what we see with Miss Amy Cooper's action and the outrage provoking the disregard for Black life that promotes the killing of Mr. George Floyd. And, when we see that situation, it's hard to watch what happened to him. It's hard. I literally could not go to sleep after watching that video. And someone might ask, what is going on? Why is this happening over and over and over? And I would like to put language to what's happening. We would like to frame this up as race maintenance. Race maintenance. As Onia talked about, there's a hierarchy that assigns meaning to different skin color. And so when you see that hierarchy of meaning must be maintained to keep some up and some down. And I know this is so hard to hear, but hear me closely. If we knew the answer, this would have stopped already. Perhaps it's time to hear some things we've never really dug into as a society, that just maybe there is as assigning to meaning to skin color, to justify injustice. So when we see this happening consistently over and over again, I feel like where we're at in our culture, where we're at today is here. It's like a frame of a building where there's no windows, there's no walls, where the only thing that's left, it's the foundation and the steel beam. And someone is consistently trying to maintain those steel beams so they can build that structure back again. That's the era we're in right now. What is remaining of this hierarchy of race that assign meaning is some steel beams. And until we identify what each steel beam is and what it represents and begin to work together as a society to say, no, we don't want to live in a society that assigns meaning to people to create injustice. And look, if this thing was created, it can be torn down. I'll say it again. If it can be created, it can be torn down. But we have to know what things to disassemble.
And we don't want you to misunderstand us when we talk about the structure and it being continually maintained. We're not saying that there are these race janitors or handymen who are going in and maintaining these structures. We're saying that because the structure is in place, because it forms the foundation of so much that we do, because inequality is already in place, then our everyday actions, even without meaning to, continue to maintain it.
Mm-hmm. And so what we want to do is we want to begin to identify these things. We want to name them for what they are and begin to dismantle it so that we can have love and unity in our society. And so when you see what happened with Mr. George Floyd, we have this triangle that's showing in this picture here. And what we see, it's just a tip of the iceberg. Whenever we see these things on camera that hurt us deeply, it's the tip of the iceberg. But when we truly understand race, we have to realize there's so much underneath that iceberg, which led for us to finally see the tip. And what we want to start talking about and get our focus on as a society is not only our frustration when we see the tip of the iceberg, but we want to work on every day to unpack all the layers of the bottom of that iceberg. And that's what I believe represent the steel frame that's still left on this construct that was created. And this is our journey as a society today. Mm-hmm. And this is how we can see a difference. And we can hopefully one day not see this as often as we do regularly in our news. And you might ask, why are we taking this time to unpack this? Are we not mad? Are we not angry? Nia and I discussed this. We have a range of emotions. And Mr. Rodney King is one of the reasons why we're showing this video. We know him as, Rodney King. In 1991, on March 3rd, officers pulled him out of his car on national TV. I think I was 11 at that age, and they beat Rodney King badly. And I remember at 11 years old looking at that video as a little kid and wondering why were people beating this man like this. And after the first trial, 3 of the people involved in that were acquitted, and 1 was a hung jury, and eventually they had a second trial. But the reason why Onia and I are presenting this teaching and trying to put some language around this is simple. What we have been doing is not working. We have incontrovertible evidence that this consistently happens. And so because of that, we have to stop and we have to unlearn what we have learned so that we can relearn what we need to learn, so that as a society of people who love and care for one another, we can begin to appropriately apply the proper solutions. And so we have to talk about these things, and we have to talk about the hierarchy and the system which allows this to continue to happen. And so we're in this very pivotal time in our society that we must begin to start talking about race in terms of systems of hierarchy that justify injustice against people of color. When we begin to talk about race like that, in this diagram, we can pull apart and begin to pull apart all the frames, all the steel beams that still exist in our country. And so what are our action steps with this? How do we do this? Our first step one of many steps is learning. Is learning and then putting that learning into action. For our white brothers and sisters, I hear you. I feel you. I know you hurt. What you see is deplorable. But if I can be very transparent, this situation that we have now, it will require, sharing your voice is so critical, but I want to prepare you. Sharing your voice is just the beginning. It will require our united action to bring about love and unity, to tear down the remaining steel beams of this system of hierarchy that was created. And look, we wouldn't be here if we didn't believe that it could happen. And the last thing that we want to talk about that's in relation to these other two things that we've talked about is the epistemology of ignorance. And what the epistemology of ignorance, it's knowledge designed to produce not knowing. I'm going to say that again. It's a framework of knowledge that's designed to produce not knowing. So how does that play into all this? So you might see the recent things that's happening all over the news, that's been happening for years in our country. And you might be with a heartfelt expression trying to share with your friend, trying to say, we have to do something about this. We have to say something. And you might hear comments like, well, we don't have all the facts. We need to look into this a little deeper. But you don't know, and you just fill in the blank. I want to equip you and help you understand that is the epitome of the epistemology of ignorance. It's a veil that's put up so that they don't have to know, so that they don't have to understand what is going on. And, I like to say it like this. It's a good thing that justice is blind, but that's only true when it does not have preference between individuals. So what happens with the epistemology of ignorance is that it blinds the mind of justice. The epistemology of ignorance, it blinds the mind of justice. So there's no understanding of a situation so that it can bring justice. And so as we're talking to people, as we're having this dialogue with one another, people are saying, well, you don't know and I don't know. Here's the reality. That is a defense mechanism. People do know what's going on in our society. And we have to call that out. We have to realize that is a defense mechanism, and we have to expose that veil of ignorance. Because if you don't know something, you don't have to take responsibility for it and help stop it if it's unjust. In addition to that, what the epistemology of ignorance often does, this framework of knowledge of, I don't know, I can't look into the details of this. What it also does is it turns what is facts into opinions. It turns clear research into opinion. And so as you're grieving, as you're mourning the recent situations, and you're trying to express this to those that you love, be careful of those who choose to be willfully ignorant to the things that is happening. Guard your heart, guard yourself, because you cannot change. Well, shouldn't say you cannot. It's really hard to change their heart and their mind if they're unwilling to look deep into the cries that we have in our streets. So one of the things that we have to do is that we have to address the epistemology of ignorance. And we have to be equipped to know that there are some who choose to be willfully ignorant. And that is a thing. So that they do not have to respond and be responsible to bring about justice and to help in situations like this. So the three things that we talked about today was, the first thing Onia talked about in her analogy was
the definition of race and how we should understand racism. And we also talked about how those racial meanings, those meanings we assign to physical appearance, can then be weaponized in certain situations in order to produce advantage for one group over another group. That can produce dangerous situations for those who are lower in that racial hierarchy than others.
And in addition, I mentioned the idea of race, if you can view it as a building with the steel beams, that structure is the last thing that's there. And it's our generation to begin to unpack what are those things that are still keeping it. And we have to look at and identify through the lens of her definition of race. And the third thing that we talked about is this idea of the epistemology of ignorance, the idea that some choose to be willfully ignorant so that they don't see. And if you don't see, it blinds the mind of justice to act. And so what do we do in this hour? How do we move forward in this hour? I'm going to use an old word that it may not make sense, but we must go as a nation and do something that I don't think we've ever done before. As a country, we must go back and properly grieve the construction of this construct that creates hierarchies and assigns meaning to different people. We must grieve it. We must atone for it. We must dialogue about it. We must uncover it, unravel it, unlock it. We must understand it so that we can begin the healing process. But if we attempt to skip the process of uncovering, unravel, of grieving it and owning it and jump to reconciliation, we will continue to see what we see happen regularly all over our news. We can't just jump to reconciliation. We must go through the process. And as a person of faith, we call this true repentance. Own it and go through that process to make atonement, to make right what was wrong. And if we truly, as a society in where we live, if we want to see things change, we must do that. But if we don't, it's an attempt to get reconciliation without going through the hard process of lamenting as a society.
So we suggest the U-curve process of repentance, or metanoia, as was created by Alan Hirsch. And this allows us to both individually and collectively go through the process of understanding where have we absorbed and where do we continue to act off of this construct of race and thereby perform racist actions on a day-to-day basis. It's only by going to the bottom of the curve where we finally understand how this got built that we're able to come out on the other side of starting to have a paradigm change and then changing our platforms or our systems, changing our practices, and having reform. I look at it as the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. There was a period that they had to go through where they mourned and they recognized the injustices that were committed as a country. And so there's no one in South Africa that can say there hasn't been a racist past and maybe even a racist present in our country, because they together have understood their common history and where they currently are. We in America, we lack that, so that people of color have a different history and a different understanding of the steps that brought us to this current moment than other folks in this country. I was teaching a class and I asked my students who was Emmett Till. And only the Black students in my class even knew who Emmett Till was. When we get to a place where we don't talk about these things because they're uncomfortable, we continue to create those divisions. So collectively, again, going through this U-curve process that we're showing of repentance to come out on the other side and create a better future is the step that we are recommending and trying to go through together.
So, at 21st Century Church, you're going to be hearing a lot more from us. We're going to be doing more things. Follow us on any of our social media platforms to partner with us and learn what we're doing. We have devoted our lives to love and unity in our society.
And love and unity, what that means for us is that we actively seek to combat any form of bias that seeks to position one person or group above another. As we take action on these things, we begin to stop sorting people into hierarchies and start seeing people for who they are, all the gifts that they bring to the table, and all of the wonderful experiences that they have. And we as a church, and then we as a society, can start to unravel these social constructs that keep us so divided, so separated, and so violent against each other.
So join us in our efforts to promote love and unity in our society and all around the world.